I love cookies. I love cookies. I love cookies. I love cookies.
Welcome to Cookies, the preseason, postseason, playoff, all season, and the very best basketball podcast. I'm Ben Detrick. Jordan Redaelli is on vacation. Fortunately, Andrew Kuo toiling away in relative obscurity.
Just swimming through Basketball Reference, enjoying Jordan's brief trip back home to DJ our event this Saturday at Kinfolk.
Yeah, that was incredible, right? Like, Jordo left the hot dog legs by the pool, came all the way home to Brooklyn to spin a DJ set, and then now he's back under palm trees with his Mai Tai.
Yeah, it's like the Jordan game, but different.
Well, thanks to Jordan, of course, naturally, he wouldn't miss it for the world. But thanks to everyone else who came out. That was really, really fun. And I had a great time meeting people who are friends of the pod and hanging at Kinfolk and having a couple beers and putting out some relegation wear. That was a lot of fun.
It was awesome. Like, I did not know what to expect, really. And everyone came out, and we were gone with a lot of, we were done selling a lot of our looks in the first few hours, and we just got to hanging out and talking to everybody about the Nets and the Sixers, and it was a really cool hang.
It's weird because I feel like years ago when we first sort of acclimated to knowing people in a digital sense, that we would become friends on Twitter or Instagram or wherever, like message boards, all that kind of thing. That kind of meeting people in real life was something that was like this odd moment that you kind of always had. And I don't even know if it's so normal now to be like, oh, I know you from Twitter. That having a bunch of people who we know, for the most part, only through our interactions online, like all in the same room and hanging out, was really kind of like a throwback and very rewarding.
Yeah, I think social interaction making us into reclusive people is like a boomer idea. It's the exact opposite. Like, the more people we talk to on our ridiculous Twitter that our interns run, the more people we talk to in real life. And like, me and you met kind of through the internet. And like,
even though we had met each other millions of times and didn't know who the other one particularly was.
Yeah, I was confused because I didn't know your last name. So me and Ben used to hang out at this bar all the time and talk all the time, and then on Twitter discuss advanced analytics and basketball. And I think at one point, like a year in, I was like, I don't want to talk about it. I'm really into like this stupid advanced analytics thing. I'm a drag. And you're like, I'm Ben Detrick. And I'm like, oh, right. This all makes sense. But yeah, I mean, like,
just two super cool dudes talking about true shooting percentage at 2:00 in a Lower East Side bar. The very, very coolest of pales.
Hey man, that's like the moment Basketball Reference like popped off, and I was very excited to be a part of that movement. But yeah, it's like screen time is actually good for you. Online interaction is actually good for you. All of these things that we assume wouldn't be that bad ended up being good, and all the things that we assume were harmless, like vaping, turns out to be really bad. And
the neck horns are great for holding hats or carrying around extra groceries in tote bags.
It's just a new look. It's just like a new representation. But before we get into that, thank you to everyone who came out. That was really awesome and kind of like, you know, pod affirming, not to get wistful, which I'm stuck with in this mode. But, you know, like, doing this pod is a lot of work, and we sit around and we work really hard at it. So it's really cool to have like a little levity, you know what I mean? Just to hang out.
I agree. It was awesome. And, you know, thank you to Top Shelf Tyson for rolling through and blessing us with a DJ set. Thanks to Sam at Kinfolk for helping to hook up the entire situation. And, you know, thanks to Kinfolk, obviously, for allowing us to host the event there. So all in all, that was really fun. And I think we want to do more IRL gang cookies crew hangs.
Absolutely. This is the Cookies plan. I think we're gonna watch some games, maybe switch venues a little bit, maybe have another thing at Kinfolk, more drops, just like hanging, and because we really enjoy talking to everybody, and sometimes doing a pod like me, you, and Jordan on vacation, it's just like ping ponging the same thing. So it's really cool to talk to fans who got free season tickets to the Nets, tried out, and got part of their like Brooklyn box or the Brooklyn block. I don't know.
Yeah, it's that fan section that's really noisy. It's near where the press people seat, the press seating. And I remember covering an exhibition game between the Sixers and Nets, and someone was yelling that Okafor was a bust. And in retrospect, hire that man. That guy is a scout.
Clairvoyant.
A prescient Nets fan in the peanut gallery.
Yeah.
There's someone out there really nailed it. More than the god Sam Hinkie.
Even more.
More gods. But yeah, so thanks for that, and keep an eye out on new stuff that we will instruct the interns to rapidly promote through Instagram and Twitter, etc.
If we can keep them alive with even less gruel.
How low can you go? Can we get it so it's basically the depth of spit on a rock and allow the interns to still subsist off of that tiny, tiny amount of gruel? Only time will tell.
Like, I don't trust the eye test with this. The interns are performing at such a high level with even less gruel. Everything just points to even less gruel.
That is the Cookies guarantee. Less gruel. Always less gruel.
Yeah.
Moving along, how was the rest of your week, Andrew?
Pretty good. I went to a GQ event. Shout out to our friends over there, Will Welsh, who's a friend of the pod. And
he is a former guest on the pod. I mean, once a guest, always a guest, but he has appeared on Cookies last season. That was a great episode. So
yeah,
yes,
I loved it.
Indeed. Shout out to Will Welch.
And they had a little Fashion Week thing where I got to talk to Julius Randle, man. Well, okay. I didn't talk to him. I said a few things to him, and we interacted for a second. I usually don't like...
Would you say he confronted you? Is that a better way of describing this encounter?
He was like, "Are you the intern's boss?" No. Like, I try not to, like, bother anybody, but we were just standing in line waiting for drinks, and I just was standing next to him for a good 15 minutes. And then finally I just turned to him and
Wait. I heard about this. You were harassing him with racial slurs, and then he knocked you unconscious? Was that you?
In a parking lot before a football game?
Yeah, that was you and Julius Randle.
That's right.
I've heard about this.
That's right. And he may or may not have been wearing a karate style headband, but a fashionable one. But I didn't know really what to say, and I just kind of I'm stuck on whist mode, as you know. But like, I just said I was grateful that he was one of the people who wanted to come to New York, and like we'd repay like kind of that space to him and like really support him, because a lot of people say no to the Knicks, and he said yes, and you can't be mad at the people who are at your party, even though there's like 4 people at your party.
And what did he say?
Thanks, man. A huge smile, just like a really nice guy. Pretty tall, but as tall as our friend Will Welsh, which is but much bigger.
How bad would you say that Randall wanted it?
Judging by his patience at the bar, not that badly, man.
That's interesting. Like, do you wait patiently at the bar because you really want to drink? Or if you really want to drink, you elbow and shoulder your way to the bar and throw people out of your way and make sure you get your drink immediately? Like, which is actually indicative of wanting it more?
When you're that tall and everyone's looking at you just because you're tall, I think like it's beneficial for you to be patient, because if you're pushy and tall, oof, man, I don't think people really like that.
Another thing, though, is that you never want to be the big professional athlete that pushes people around, and then everyone says, "Yeah, I saw Randle at that party. He was like shoving me to get a beer," and everyone's like, "Oh, Randle, like he just wants beers, and he's willing to like shove small, weak people around at a fashion party because he just wants to get a Michelob clasped in his paw." So you kind of have to exercise some delicate caution there if you're a a 6'7" bruiser of a power forward and you're thirsty.
The god Chris Bosh was also there, dressed in white, who I was doing a little NBA splaining, but I described him as the unsung kind of trailblazing player that had influence over the game that no one talks about, and how like those Miami championships were kind of, in my mind, just as much as about him as Dwayne Wade.
Without getting into a whole discussion of the Heatles and the evolution of that team, we really did see a moment of transition when Chris Bosh went there and was playing power forward. And then within 3 years, he was kind of like a stretch five. And unfortunately, his health ailments kind of pushed him out of the league before we could really see his full evolution into a rim protecting, mobile stretch five who could guard a lot of different positions, score in a lot of different ways, and sort of kind of become almost what Kevin Garnett was too early to ever actually play like. I mean, Bosh was a forerunner to the sort of rim running, lob catching, but also 3-point shooting big man that we view as an archetype for the five today.
Yeah, and Bosh, like, we never really got to see Alpha Bosh, but he was on the cusp of that basketball genius thing we talk about all the time, right? Like, he was some guy who understood the layout of every play and every defensive possession for the opposing team. And I was really looking forward to him kind of flexing his brain and his, like, he was the perfect player to a degree.
Well, it's interesting because there are certain guys whose greatness is a product of their era. Like Ben Wallace is a great example. If he came into the NBA now, he would likely be too offensively limited to be a superstar. But in that era, which was so defensively oriented, you could live with the fact that he was a very poor offensive player because he gave you so much in an era where defense was so predominant. And Bosh was one of those guys that I don't think it mattered. He could have played like the traditional forward of the Garnett ilk who took, long twos, guarded some big guys, maybe some spot duty at center, or he could have totally been a Karl Anthony Towns offensive player today, taking people off the dribble, shooting threes, but protecting the rim, along the same way right now as like a Nerlens or something. I just think Bosh, no matter when you put him in the NBA, would have been an absolute stud.
I think of Rasheed Wallace kind of, and to your point, like players who benefited from their era, there's some players who excelled but didn't quite benefit from their era, and I think of Rasheed Wallace. He's probably more useful today than he was back then.
And, the real guy that we're getting to here is naturally Keith Van Horn. Many people said that Bosh could have gone on to become Keith Van Horn had he not been sidelined by blood clots in his legs.
Oh, yeah, on a scale from 1 to Keith Van Horn, Bosh is a solid 6.
Yeah, he's like a KVH, just missing one of the little pillars coming up on the one side of the H. Like, it's very close to the full KVH.
What'd you do this fashion week?
I didn't do much. I really was off the beat. I didn't really do much style section work. And as I mentioned last show, I wanted to see the Kalina Strada runway show, which took place 2 days ago. And it was exciting. It was cool to see a young up-and-coming designer go from sort of practicing their craft in relative obscurity and see the upward trajectory to having a lot of eyeballs on her and the brand now expanding and having a bigger budget, and all these things that are indicative of success, but the brand stayed very true to the principles that it gained notoriety for in the first place. Like, it was just like, yeah, Kalina Strada did what Kalina Strada has always done. And that was nice to see. It was like Manson family environmentalism, kind of this family and a diverse group of models and very exciting casting with this slightly unhinged, wild-eyed edginess to it. So it was about saving the planet and using fresh produce and tote bags and all these things that easily could have come off as cloying or self-righteous, but there was enough of like an odd screwball energy beneath it and like art kid presentation that made it a little chaotic in a good way. So that was fun. That was the only thing I really did.
I looked at the looks from that show, and the looks look cool. And I don't think we talked about Euphoria on this pod, but I really love that show, and I really love, like, I'm very, very thankful to like Gen Z for coming in and kind of upending what the millennials had done to like fashion and music and even sports. And maybe you can talk to this, and maybe I'm reaching a little bit, but like already it's so accelerated that you're seeing like a fracturing of the way Gen Zers are trying to like align themselves in like the Colin Estrada stuff is this great kind of a lot of tactile forms and like tie-dye and kind of vintage feels to it. And opposing it, you have maybe like I walked into opening ceremony maybe a couple weeks ago, and I was really blown away by like how advanced it felt. But while that stuff was also present there, it had a vibe of like race car shirts, new metal, like this kind of mining of Gen X imagery, and I don't know.
I think that's true because you have ultimately different influences that speak to different designers,
of course,
from obviously. So when people are really mining those retro ideas, monster beverage drinks and like I said, race cars and Ed Hardy and new metal, it's people looking back to the early 2000s, whatever, like 2003, 2005. Like we're pushing forward. It's like that 15-year turnaround, I think, is sort of the natural like reversal of trends. It always seems to be that. And it kind of speeds up and slows down in different places. It's not a hard and fast rule. But typically you're like, okay, 15 years ago, we're looking at 2004. That's where we're at right now. Like we're at Paris Hilton. We're at, like Hummers and I don't know, Dipset, whatever. Like it's like a distinct moment. But then you also have this other sort of weird blowback almost to wellness. Like you had wellness as a response to the whiskey, meat-eating, alpha male, Greenpoint bearded guy thing. And then now you have this like kind of messy sort of response almost to that pristine white tiling. Like there's just so many design elements. Like Puppets and Puppets is another brand that's kind of on the upswing, young women designers. And it's also that kind of like a lot of face paint, and it's just very art school sort of haphazard. And I think it's intentional.
Yeah, and there's a theory about like cycling through images like 14 or 15 years, stuff coming back. And what is going to be the theme of this episode is skepticism. And I think a healthy kind of skepticism to the generation that preceded you kind of informs you in really valuable ways. And I always bring up this program called Quark. And back in the day, before Adobe InDesign, everyone did stuff in this design program called Quark. And it was based off of a grid and boxes and placing images within boxes. And the whole time we were using it back then, we tried to break the idea of the grid. And now all these kids are coming out and be like, we love this idea of the grid. We embrace this kind of vibe that you guys were denying a little bit. And Marilyn Manson was a very, very popular artist, but he didn't he didn't get through the gatekeepers of like niche fashion. Do you know what I mean? Of course, like people really love goth traditionally, and new metal was an extrapolation of that. But we're seeing kind of like this newer generation kind of like side-eyeing us, and I love the skepticism. Not only they direct towards good skepticism that they direct towards Gen X, but also millennials and wellness. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about is like this idea of representation and how that was such a big millennial movement. And in a lot of these fashion shows, we see not traditional model, like people of color, people of different ages, people of different sizes, and people of different identifications of genders and all this stuff. And a thought I had was like, we're not quite talking about the totality of representation, and nothing should be the totality of everything. But all these people, whether they have all these uncharacteristic or unidentifiable model aspects to them, are all like super hyper cool people. So it's just like at some representation level, maybe just like as whatever, a funny thing in my mind, it's like, can we get some not cool people in here? Because everyone is just like deathly cool, right?
So you want representation for
maybe not like
like what are you advocating? Like you're like, all right, it's diverse in terms of body types and ages and this, but they're all still cool. So let's get some people who are like into advanced metrics, and they're at the bar, and it's 3 in the morning, and they're arguing about BPM and VORP, and like get them into a fashion show.
But it's almost the same thing that we were doing before, but just we moved the goalposts a little. And this is the problem. Well, this is the problem I have kind of like embracing this whole idea of like, we need an Asian guy in this, or we need a short person in this. It's like, well, like basketball players are tall, so the taller ones are more valuable. It's like, well, what about the short guys? And I'm like, oh, right, that's what millennials were pushing for. And sometimes that doesn't quite click. And I think that's where maybe and I love the millennial generation, but like that's maybe where like that conversation kind of ended for them, and then the younger people are taking that over, and we'll talk about this, but not only like,
but isn't fashion supposed to be aspirational though, right? So
that's my point.
It's about, but that's why the people are cool, and that's why they are cool looking, and that's why they're cast to look cool, because that's the job of the industry. But we're talking about standards of beauty being shifted from being reed skinny, wayfish, white 15-year-old from Slovenia who is raised by fucking wolves to people who look like everyday New Yorkers but are cool.
Yeah.
Or everyday, no matter where you live, but are cool.
And we need to keep on doing this over and over for a long time for it not to feel like a move, because at first everything feels like a move. You show up wearing like a head tie to a game, and you're like, oh, that's a move. And then 4 years later, like, oh, everyone wears those things.
I agree. That's a good point, because our brands and designers embracing diversity and, people who are androgynous because it's the trend right now, and then we're going to go back to very traditional Eurocentric standards of beauty in like 3 seasons. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
We'll see. But right now it feels like someone just rolled up to the court in a headband or a Supreme armband, It's like, oh my God, this is incredible. He's wearing a Supreme armband. But in 5 years, if everyone wears them, like, that's just what ballers look like, So I'm just curious, and I think this is like something discussed out of the sports world by really smart people, and I can't really talk to that on that level, but it's something that is interesting to me as we are doing the thing. Like wellness is a huge industry because we can't really figure it out.
Yeah, I view the diversity and the different kinds of people, whether it's it's race or age or body shape or gender identification or lack thereof as progress. I just don't know if it's superficial or if it's going to be real. I don't know if it has to be one or the other at this point. It's more like, where are we going? And will we get to a place where everyone can feel as if they're attractive and that clothes are being made for them and not for someone else? I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. Like, I know exactly what I look like, and every time someone's just like, "Oh, you look great," and I'm like, "Thanks for that little that little stab in there," But
so you're saying when people compliment you, you're viewing it as like a diss,
or it's like, you usually don't look this way, whatever. But that's like just a joke I'm trying to mine. But but like, even there's a joke on Twitter about like the podcast world being predominantly male, and it's just like a bunch of dudes podding. But it's so odd because my pod feed doesn't feel like that. So it's all within the framework of what you're looking at.
That's very true.
Yeah,
well,
you can curate through it. I don't know. It's just something that like is definitely a theme of this fashion week.
Yeah, I think we've seen this for
a long time,
a little while. This has been a few years coming, and at this point, it does seem a bit like the new normal. It doesn't
really?
Seem like. Yeah, I do. I think that.
I only ask that because people still draw attention to it. Therefore, it's not normal. People are like, look at these models. I'm like, oh, we're not at the place where it's normal yet.
But Hood by Air was doing this a few years ago. Rick Owens did it a few years ago. And now it's so across the board. If you're young and kind of edgy, like maybe if you're Prabal Guring and you're trying to do evening gowns, that's not where you're at. And that's like a different plateau of design and fashion. But if you're young and trying to come up as a cool company, you're trying to be diverse. You're trying to show that
the rule now.
You have a certain worldview. And I don't know that those people are going to shift back to a different sort of old school ideal of, Anna Wintour's like wayfish teenagers in 3 years. I just don't know. But yeah. I just feel like that's kind of how brands are now going to do their casting, and we'll just have to get, and that it's expected.
Yeah. Occasionally, someone will ask me, like, to what degree the things I do are about being Asian American, and how come I don't talk about it outwards enough or more. And my answer is always, I am Asian American, so what I do is coming from my point of view, and my dream is to just be compared to everyone else doing the thing that they're doing instead of just being the Asian American guy. And the goal in my life personally is to just be compared to people doing stuff, not an Asian American guy doing the thing that other people do.
I mean, look, as a white dude, a straight white dude, I'm always growing up, you're always like the standard. It's like everyone else is described as in juxtaposition to like the straight white dude.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know how that's going to shift entirely in our lifetimes, but
it doesn't have to either.
But well, it's like what you're saying though, is that you're like, I want to be just viewed as another guy doing like art.
Yeah. Which is like unrealistic, right?
But that's what I mean. As long as the standard is going to be like straight white dudes, then they're like, what about him? Like, oh, he's an Asian artist. And like, I agree. That's not ideal. It should be this thing where we're just talking about people on the basis of what they've accomplished or what they're doing or how stupid they are or what, like anything.
Yeah. And I'm not naive enough to think that that's how the world works. It's just like it's something to think about. And when I left the country for the first time to a non-white place, it was incredible. Like my brain exploded. And of course, like in advertising and fashion and movies, it is the white ideal. But in everyday life in China or Japan, it's incredible to be around a place where it isn't, you know?
Well, this brings us to a good subject, which is the NBA's announcement that the Karate Kid Kung Fu style headbands that were popularized by guys like Jimmy Butler and Mike Scott and Drew Holiday, Montrezl Harrell.
Wait, say that again. That was amazing.
Montrezl Harrell? Is it Montrezl Harrell?
Montrez Harrell. But I'm down for it, man. Montrezl is my favorite name moving forward.
I thought I could just rhyme the whole thing together. Montrezl Harrell.
Are you in the cipher?
I've got bars here. But anyway, that group of guys and a few others popularized these headbands that are tied in the back. And they have a little sort of dangling straps that wave behind in a sort of chaotic, interesting way. And the NBA this week, via a report from Woj that was preceded by Mike Scott kind of tweeting about it, has said no more. They are not allowed to be worn in NBA games going forward. What do you think of that, Kuo? Speaking of things that are white people deciding the standards of beauty and the standards of, let me quote from the NBA's vernacular, professionalism.
I mean, uniform rules and all those things I think every company is allowed to dictate their own terms. But it's funny how we call them kung fu and ninja head ties, because they look like do-rags to me. And the 90s kind of Nelly kind of look, you know what I mean? And it's odd that the NBA took a direct swift action to address these things, where Kelly Olynyk is running up and down the court with really long hair, and that's not dangerous. I don't know how two pieces of cloth could be dangerous, but it almost seems like, to give the NBA credit, I think they're just trying to streamline their look, and having a headband with that much flair kind of it is the wrong branding. Maybe? Could we do that?
Well, we can dispel their ostensible caring about the players and their safety. No one is really worried that this is a health risk, that someone's going to be blinded by a flailing, frayed end of a headband. It got caught in someone's hand and they broke their thumb because of a headband. No one is worried about that. They are small, dangling things of cloth. No one cares. Mm-hmm. It comes down to what you said. Is the NBA worried that this looks ethnic, and the fact that no white guys wore this? Is a do-rag associated with an era that the NBA has tried to banish, and the dress code was put in place to try to usher the Iversonian looks that bridging hip-hop and street fashion and basketball into dandyism, basically? Or is this just what you said? It's too individual for a team sport, that it's too distracting to viewers because one player out there is wearing an accessory that moves in a different way than what we're used to seeing on a basketball court.
It no sin bin, but it reminds me of an employer like the Yankees, and they don't allow their players to have facial hair or longish hair. Don Mattingly kind of got away with that if you're good enough, right? But I get that. If the NBA just wants to make their look in the owner's image, and it doesn't have kind of the connotations that we're mining for, that's fine. They also don't want other logos on headbands, and they have contracts with companies. There's so many rules that go into it. Just dwelling on this may be overreaching.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit split on it. On one hand, I'm always fundamentally opposed to the league coming down with restrictions on what its players can wear. Not always, but 99% of the time. I don't particularly enjoy a multi-billion-dollar company telling its employees what they can wear.
Yeah,
and saying you can't express yourself as a player wearing this garment that it's kind of like a headband, but it has things that hang in the back, but we don't want you to have that. Yeah. But on the other hand, while I like the look and it's kind of cool, I don't love it only because it is a bit foreign to the basketball court. So as a stodgy traditionalist that you know I am, I just don't really associate that look with basketball. And it's not that I even care about that, but I do find it a little bit distracting. In the same way, though, that I'm not used to guys having dreads on the basketball court. And I don't mind it, and I think people can wear whatever they want. So I'm also like, well, if you want to wear headbands and you want to have dreads, that's all cool. But I feel like growing up, guys who had dreads and played ball were just like always out of control. It was just something you associated with dudes who played crazy because like their hair would go all over the place, and it was just not a basketball look until like the last couple of years.
And this is an eye test thing. This is like
totally eye test, yes.
Yeah, but it's a natural thing, and every single like animal does that, and colors make us react a certain way, and visuals. And I was thinking about remember when Kobe tried to wear the black mask, or was it the black? He tried to customize it, and the NBA was like, "You're only allowed to do like clear, maybe black, and you can't do white."
Yeah, I can't remember with Kobe. I know LeBron tried to wear the black one, and they wouldn't let him do it.
I know.
The Kobe one I don't recall.
Like, I really wanted those masks to turn into old school hockey masks where they could paint like war paint on them, or like a lion's face. That would have been so rad. But looking at it as a presentable product, it's confusing. And it's like, what do you do? The tiger has to be in your team colors. Does your team colors have to like coincide with the style of uniform you're wearing that night? It gets really confusing, where I'm sure Silver's like, you just can't do it.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what would make the NBA say, let's step in, because we can't have those kind of headbands. I just don't feel that kind of passion about it in order to say, wow, we got to get rid of them. I just don't care. Even if I don't love it optically, because, you know, growing up, you had like Brian Grant had dreads. I feel like Sam Perkins grew some little sprouts. There just weren't many NBA players who had long hair. It was not a thing. It wasn't like the NFL where, you know, Mark Gastineau and these dudes had hair growing out of the back of their helmets. It just wasn't Ricky Williams. It just was not a part of basketball style. And now that it is, I feel like the NBA saying you can't wear these headbands is like kind of close to saying we don't like you having dreads.
Right. One of the most egregious tendencies I have, and I know it's bad, is like when a player shows up after the summer and is covered in tattoos or has a very stylistically drastic look. Cherokee Parks, for example, came in and just covered. I'm like, what's going on in his life? Like, is he concentrating on basketball? This is very, very boomer of me, I know. But it reminded me of that weakness I have in the way I look at sports. And I think the tie-dye, the head tie thing is different because I just really love the way they look. And I think we were all really excited for this small kind of change. But I get where the boomerology comes in, and it's not even a malicious thing. It's just they're looking to tighten up the shit. And whatever that means, I think we shouldn't read too much into this headband thing, even though it's fun too.
Yeah, I think we have to roast the NBA for it. That goes without saying. Right. The NBA coming out and giving the rationale for it being a health thing and them being worried about the players is so transparently bullshit that they deserve to be roasted and flambéed and clam baked for, you know, that bullshit.
Yeah,
the NBA does not give a fuck about the players particularly. They do, but you know what I'm saying. They don't overall.
They give a fuck about stars.
Yes, but it's kind of, you know, the interns, I believe, had put up a tweet, and it sort of juxtaposed, oh, well, we're really worried about you. We're going to have a salary cap, but we're not going to let you. We're going to be patronize you or paternalizing or whatever the word I'm looking for is by protecting you from yourself and your urges to wear flamboyant headwear. But we also have the salary cap, and you are more or less locked into the same team for the first 9 years of your career.
Yeah, it's the idea that the NBA seems to pay attention to this minute detail that doesn't matter, yet still has a minimum age restriction for its company, which seems unconstitutional. Maybe
it's insane to frame headbands as a public safety issue that the NBA is stepping in to solve.
And it's funny how humans think, right? It's like, we cannot discuss the NCAA age minimum rules because it's too big of a problem, but we could just take care of self-expression like that with a snap of a finger. And both those things are not like the tides or the rising of the sun. Like, they're all man-made things that we can change. If they decided to just change the way they thought about the salary cap, it would just be changed.
Yes. And this is why the gun control debate is so infuriating and so ludicrous, because it's not like healthcare where it would require the upheaval of a current system, and there are a lot of logistics and existing industries that need to be changed. Look, I'm for universal healthcare. I'm just saying that's the reality. It's a enormous, absolutely, just like Kelly Olynyk, just an enormous industry and a huge change.
True.
With gun control, it's just like, all right, you can't sell those anymore. Done.
My question with gun control is, how powerful is the NRA, and when will they be done? Because all reports is that they're losing money and they don't have the influence that they did. And I'm just watching. It's just one group of people trying to do this.
They're only giving your boy Chuck Grassley like $30,000, like a Hyundai Elantra.
They stopped serving free coffee at the NRA. Things are going downhill there, man.
Coffee's for shooters.
It's like, sorry, we have no coffee for you. Tap water.
Always
White Claw.
Closing. Here's the thing, though. Look, not to open up the whole gun debate thing, but this has been on my mind, and it kind of fits into this idea of when you can just change things via dictum. It doesn't require even doing anything other than just saying it, and then it's so. Is that in this gun control debate, we have gun enthusiasts who just want us to be able to have bazookas and grenade launchers and no laws at all, right? So that's the hardline NRA guys are like, you can have anything you want. Any kind of killing machine or instrument is cool. Then you have gun control, which is still acknowledging that it's okay to have guns for protecting your house, or it's okay to shoot at clay pigeons or want to hunt raccoons to make raccoon venison and whatnot. And I'm like, okay, but where's the Overton window shift here to being fully anti-gun? Why isn't that voice part of this equation? Why are we conceding that people need to be able to, shoot at cat burglars or take down deer or shoot at clay pigeons? Like, why are we making the argument, or why are we allowing that to stand as a legitimate argument instead of saying, no, there's pro-gun, there's anti-gun, and then gun control falls in the middle? So it's kind of like this idea where you're like, the NBA can just decide things. So let's change what we're arguing. Let's say, okay, everyone needs to wear the same uniform. Done. That's our argument. So for gun control, okay, no guns. And how would we do that? By law. And we can just declare it. And that's that.
And I'm the technocrat, but you're right, because that's what we did with marijuana. It's like, you go to jail for possessing this illegal thing. Actually, it's legal now. Like,
right,
whoa.
That's what I mean. There's nothing even to do. You just say it. It's like, oh, by the way, you can't have any guns anymore. And if you have any kind of gun, you're going to jail for 5 years, which means that they can't be manufactured, which means you can't make ammunition for the ones that exist. You can't have gun shows. If anyone sees one, then at your house, you risk like them telling someone and the police coming to get it from you. And then, of course, there's this argument from like the conservatives, like, well, that's going to cause, huge gunfights between gun owners and police. And it's like, that's your argument for letting people keep guns? That they'll murder policemen if you try to take them away? Like, that sounds like they're violent, dangerous people who would murder over relatively nothing. They probably shouldn't then have firearms.
Yeah, and those are examples that definitely support that case. But I fall on the side, not surprisingly, of like Gilbert Arenas does not have to shoot for an entire game to tell us he's an unselfish player. Kobe Bryant doesn't have to change his entire game to become a top 20 player of all time. All they had to do was little things. And I think with the gun debate, I find it to be pretty reasonable to not say all guns are illegal, but to say they are very, very difficult to get, sort of like a green card or a driver's license.
Look, I'm with that. I don't have a problem with people owning hunting rifles. I don't have a problem with people having a gun in theory to protect their possessions or their house, whatever. I'm not even saying I'm an absolutist, other than that it's not hard to have that point of view be expressed. Mm-hmm. And like, that's as legitimate as saying, let's have some gun control. Saying get rid of all guns is totally legitimate too. I'm just saying that if you don't like guns, I don't think you should concede that people need guns for shooting targets and squirrels. Like, that to me doesn't seem like a great argument for having weapons that can kill people legal in America. And they just let those people make those arguments and then say, no, man, I gotta like shoot at rats in my backyard, so I gotta have this gun. You're like, dude, get a cat. Like, get a ADT alarm if you're scared of intruders coming into your house. Like, grow up and get a different target. Hunt with a bow. Like, let gun people make those arguments and not gun control people.
And I think we have to parse the idea of the concept, which you're talking about, and the discussion. And the discussion is, there are people who feel this way, but you cannot approach this problem that way because it just turns into a debate of ideology. You have to come to a solution. That's why people are landing on the idea of background checks and making it a little bit harder, because there are people who, the pendulum swings both ways. I want my guns. You should not be able to have your guns. And the people in the debate are like, we need to have a discussion where both sides can consider this as a solution.
Yeah, that's what I'm not into that incrementalism, like theoretically. It's
theoretical, right? We're talking in theory only, though.
Right. So if you believe in gun control, I think you need to make the argument that people who have guns are the equivalent of people who have samurai swords. Like, you fucking dork. You have a samurai sword? You're trying to master the way of the blade?
Don't shame Wu-Tang fans, man.
But that idea, like, you're a dork. You have a samurai sword. What is wrong with you, you loser? Like, why are you carrying that around on public transportation? Like, that's unacceptable. And if we had waves of samurai sword attacks throughout America, they'd be made illegal immediately. Like, immediately. You could not be able to have a samurai sword if we had, like, 4,000 samurai sword deaths in America per year. But we need to stigmatize gun ownership in a way that it's not a cherished American tradition. That's my entire thing. It's like, if you want to get rid of really dangerous guns, you should be arguing that we should get rid of all guns.
I mean, the samurai sword argument is difficult because that is not a paradigm that has to be shifted. You're talking about something we were talking about earlier about representation and like the white male trope. And I think that takes a long time. You can't just say, okay, Asian men are the thing now. I just decided that. Sure, you could decide that, and many people could decide that, but it takes time for people to understand that they need to shoot 53s a game.
Yes, I'm only talking Overton window things here. Mm-hmm. That's really the crux here, and we can, of course, apply that to the NBA. You look back at the 90s and the 80s. Larry Bird took I don't even know the exact number. He took something like 1.5 threes per game. Mm-hmm. He takes less threes per 36 minutes than like Amir Johnson.
Magic Johnson didn't shoot threes because he's a power forward, but Kevin Garnett, as we talk about all the time, should have took one step back to become one of the most efficient players of all time instead of just one of the great players of all time.
But it's the Overton window shifted, that we all now understand that 3 is worth more than 2. Back in the 80s, they didn't have the technology to realize that a 3 was worth more than 2.
Yeah.
They were back then thinking a 3 and 2 were equal.
And this is what I was talking
Because
about.
the NBA didn't exist.
Yeah, and the difference between healthy skepticism and contrarian skepticism. It's hard to figure out where that lies because maybe in the 80s there were nerds who said, take as many 3s as you possibly can because they're the most valuable shot. 3 is more valuable than 2 and so on. But that sounded and that was perceived as contrarian skepticism. It took years for someone to phrase it as, take a look at what value is, take a look at the stock market, take a look at your wallet and how money behaves. You're doing the same thing in a game with counting stats.
Well, Larry Bird is, to me, the best example of this, though, because he is one of the greatest shooters of all time in basketball lore. Like Larry Bird, genius player and incredible shooter. We all remember the clip of him at the three-point contest. I mean, just if you're going to list the best shooters of all time, Bird is always in that conversation. You know, he shot 1.9 threes per game for his career. And that was during seasons when he was playing, 39, 40 minutes a game. So we're talking about per 36 minutes by, today's measures, even less than that. And, he shot 37.6% for his career. There's like a tick over league average today. Mm-hmm. So it's weird when you think about this idea. It's not just that we realized threes were better. It was that realization spurred change. And then we had a wholesale shift. So that's kind of the idea with even the gun control. If you change the Overton window, then you change behavior that goes along with that window, and then you get meaningful change.
Explain.
It's like a chicken and the egg thing.
Before you go on, explain to the listeners what you think the Overton window is, just so they know.
Well, my understanding of it, which could be off, is just more along the lines of how do we frame an argument? Mm-hmm. And how far to the margins does it go? And what's kind of like the median viewpoint of discussion? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know that was using viewpoint there was a clumsy attempt at the window analog. But the idea of, okay, when we talk about this subject, here's the parameters on which is acceptable. And if you push it to this direction, new things become acceptable. If you shift it the other way, those ideas that would have been totally normal are now out of the frame.
Yeah, I agree. And it brings me to a guy I've been thinking about a little bit, David Epstein, and he just put out a book called Range about just to summarize it, it's kind of an antithesis to the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours idea, where Malcolm Gladwell presented the argument that's been debunked a million times or a few times of if you want to be an expert in something, you got to put in the work. And 10,000 hours was his kind of arbitrary number, but he used like the Beatles as an example. He used people who become experts. And it does kind of ring true in certain cases, but Epstein put out a book called Range that kind of pushes back on this idea constructively and maybe opens up the idea that talent plays a role in skill or vice versa. And you do not need to put in hours. And sometimes the scope of your asking questions can supersede maybe just looking at one thing over and over. So, for example, if you are a basketball analyst and you're just concentrating on advanced analytics, you're not looking at maybe how organizations behave, how leases behave in arenas, what's the motivation of the owner, etc., all that stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's weird because it's like, here's this new idea, but it's basically saying, like, don't be myopic.
Yeah, and I found myself kind of in the middle of both arguments, and it depends on what you want to feel about yourself. And this is the really basic thing. If you do more than one thing, if you love sports, but you also love movies, you would say to yourself, right, I use my interest in movies to inform my interest in sports and vice versa. Therefore, I have a unique perspective on this thing as opposed to someone who just watches movies. That's true if you do it. And I believe it's wherever your starting point is. And this skepticism towards both ends of this idea ping pong back and forth, and it'll ping pong back and forth endlessly depending on where you lie on it. And this is a whole industry at this point. The industry being maybe the evolution of wellness, of books that talk about the way you think over and over. And there's no way to solve this, and it becomes something you can purchase and buy and read and go pay attention to and listen to a podcast. And for $5.99, you can listen to me every month talk about the way you should think about your scope of interest.
I mean, self-improvement has been an industry forever. I mean, whether it's Jane Fonda workouts or Richard Simmons or, mushroom herbal tea that is supposed to help your tummy.
And it's distinctly American, right?
I have no idea because, I think in a much more grim sense, it goes back to that discussion we had about standards of beauty. You have skin lightening treatments in Africa and Asia or South America. Like look at Sammy Sosa, changing his skin. So I don't think it's uniquely
That's an outlier, though.
American.
Something's going on with Sammy.
That's true, but didn't Vibes Cartel do the same thing?
Yes, and something's going on with Vibes too. You're like these are all these specific things, right? I think we, as human beings and as curious human beings, you always have to take examples to support your argument.
But skin lightening ointments are like an actual industry in Africa.
But so
that's clearly a product of colonialism. But I'm saying,
but so is tanning, right?
I just don't think the whole industry of self-improvement is distinctly American. I think it may have reached its natural apex in America because we're in a particular capitalist moment right now.
Yeah, and this is my mellow skepticism of these industries creeping in, because that's how I think about politics. A lot of these things that people talk about in regards to politics kind of transforms into a hobby, and not actual politics with hypothetical capital P. And I think it's what Trump does from day to day. Everyone wants to follow it, and everyone can talk about something he said, a Sharpie, and that's not actual policy. That is just something someone who's very powerful did that was stupid. And I think we confuse that thing, and the Democrats and Republicans know this. So they kind of perpetuate an economy back and forth between each other, sort of like skepticism or 10,000 hours and the range, and it ping pongs back and forth where this energy is sustainable by itself and we just orbit it. We're never actually participating in it.
Well, just bring this back around to range for a second here, because I haven't read it. I did order it, and it's because I've seen it praised mightily by people who are basketball minds that I think are exceptional, like Ben Falk from Cleaning the Glass, or Daryl Morey from the Houston Rockets. That particular breed of analytic forward basketball heads are really into this book. And as you said, it was discussed on Zach Lowe. What is the connection between range and hoops? You alluded to things about like the arena, but why are all these guys really into this book right now?
And he also wrote a book called The Sporting Gene that was pretty amazing about the way we frame talent in athletics. But in regards to range and how it relates to the NBA, it's sort of, and this is what we discuss about with Klay Thompson all the time. Like, where does our skepticism start and end? Because me and you think about Klay in distinctly different ways, and I'm not sure.
Is Klay still even in the league?
Is Klay? Can you start a team with Klay? Would you start a team with Klay Thompson or Steph Curry? But basically, what it says is, I think it's he makes the argument that it's aspirational to have a wider scope of viewing an argument rather than pinpointing a specific part of an argument. And in relation to Zach Lowe and the community of basketball analytics, to me, I read it as a healthy skepticism. But Zach Lowe framed it as maybe you have questions about a shooter, but that question of that shooter opens up to a question of his teammates, opens up a question to ownership, GM, maybe perception, the way we're framing the thing that we're criticizing. And that is very helpful in thinking about a problem, sort of in the way that remember Google hired all these smart people that were not related to tech, like the puzzle champion of the world. They just hired him. If you're like a champion chess player, they just hired you to sit around. It didn't quite work, but that ethos is what this book is kind of about.
Forgive me if I tread on terrain that was discussed on either this podcast or in the book itself. But when I think about this concept of range and non-compartmentalization and non-specialization, there are some basketball avenues that make sense to explore beyond even those for, say, a GM or an organization, but about players themselves. And the first thing that I think of is that a study that ESPN put out recently about how athletes coming out of high school basketball and AAU systems have played so much of the same sport, but they're suffering injuries that you would see from guys much later in their careers while in their teenage years. So that's one thing, that there's a literal physical benefit to playing different sports instead of just playing basketball on a highly competitive level for your entire, youth, adolescence, and schoolboy career. So that kind of makes sense to me. But from a basketball standpoint, we've been preaching against specialists for a while. Like, unitaskers are, to me, very flawed, and we've seen good teams already leaning towards this idea that having specialists is a problem, and you need guys with diverse skill sets. Like, Eric Gordon is not an awesome player, but he's better to have than, say, JJ Redick, because he can kind of pass. He can put the ball on the floor. He's not a good defender, but he's a little bit better. And just that idea of, if you can get one good skill, but you're not hampered by that player in other elements of the game, it's like a huge advantage for your team.
Exactly, and that was my skepticism. I gotta find a different word. Towards
skepticism is the theme. You're allowed to use it over and over. It's like the movie The Killer, when that haunting little melody comes in.
Or in the movie Face Off, where they say Face Off like 4 times.
Dude, they're remaking Face Off.
I'm gonna watch the shit out of that.
I gotta watch Face Off again. I think I saw it 3 times in the theaters back then.
John Woo is tough, but those guys are great.
I can't tell if that movie is awesome or awful, and I'm ready to find out again.
John Woo is really tough. I think his aesthetic that he brought over from China it wasn't met with like the same. Well, actually, I take that back. Face Off was a huge movie. Those doves, man, I don't know. It just wasn't for me. But Nicolas Cage was for me. I don't know.
I liked some of John Woo's stuff, like The Killer, but it was also tied in so much with like Wu-Tang Clan and sort of being cult movies in an era where you were getting those from like Blockbuster on VHS tapes and stuff. So there's like a weird, that's what I'm saying. There's a weird element of like, oh, you had to go digging in the crates to find like a better tomorrow or some shit.
For sure. Oh, right, yeah. I mean, that's a whole different themed pod right there. The idea of like a subculture and discovering things, but the challenge of finding that access point also sculpts the way that we view those movies. Who has
differently when you can just look at all of them. Like, I haven't watched any of them in years, even though you can watch any of them if you feel like it.
Yeah, have you heard about this group, the KLF, that was big in London for a while? They deleted their entire digital footprint and like burned all their money. That's for a different pod, but that's also Young Thug related. A lot of his tapes you can't even stream, I don't think.
Are they in relegation?
Oh, they relegated themselves. But back to the range thing. So that's where I had doubt, which was, it's also feasible for someone just to say, hey, do what you do well a lot, man. You're really good at shooting. Just shoot well. You don't have to dribble. You don't have to be the totality of what we think a basketball player should be. You don't have to watch movies. You don't have to know about politics. Just do your studies. Practice the violin if that's what you want. And I think that is even clearer sounding to me than the idea of range.
Right. The shooting one is a tricky subject too, because the specialist of a 3-point shooting specialist is just less valuable now because everyone else can shoot. Like, the game caught up with those outlier talents and kind of rendered those guys far less uniquely valuable than they were during sort of the 3-point renaissance, where you could just stick a couple shooters on the court and it would give you a competitive advantage that offensively made up for the fact that they weren't giving you other things. And now when you can just find a PJ Tucker and stick him in a corner and he makes 38% of his threes, but gives you all these other dimensions as a kind of a different sort of specialist, there's no contest.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up violin, because you could practice and be an expert in violin, but being an excellent violin player in 2019 isn't as valuable as it was maybe a few hundred years ago.
But if you want to be a really good violin player, you have to have a pinky that you can move in isolation from your ring finger, which is genetic.
Yeah, right. And one of my favorite Epstein things in the Sports Gene that he said was Daryl Morey really was one of the first GMs to value players with short necks, because everyone looked at him and said they weren't tall enough just because optically they look short. And he was like, oh no. And PJ Tucker has a tiny neck. It's like, these guys are great.
Chris Bosh benefited from neck bias for the vast majority of his career, but he lived up to his neck bias reputation.
That's right. Channing Frye also has neck bias. Maybe he did not live up to that reputation.
Yeah, there was one guy, I remember reading that, actually, that segment of that book about Daryl Morey and the necks, and it was like a small center who ended up not panning out, but he was really into like the low neck centers.
Yeah, they're all like villains in the first level of Double Dragon that you like cast off before the boss, the easiest boss.
You know, speaking of villains, Donovan Mitchell, a member of law enforcement who will not cross the thin blue line, has had his reputation altered a bit this offseason.
If we're paying attention to FIBA.
Which no one is.
No.
But there is a little bit of a change in the way he's been viewed, despite the fact that he just turned 23 this week. Happy birthday, officer. He's now viewed with suspicion and some may say skepticism.
No.
That haunting word of the boy. That is perhaps premature or maybe now necessary considering his first two seasons in the NBA. But it's interesting. There is a change in the way that Devin Booker also became divisive really, really early in his career. 2 years in, a year and a half in, people started already being skeptical of these guys. Why is Donovan Mitchell now seemingly a non-fan favorite? Or maybe a villain?
I don't think he is yet. I think to us, we kind of just looked at the way he performed, and we just looked at his numbers without the dribble bias aspect, in that he looks like he should be a better player than he is just because he's cool looking and he's a guard and he's that prototype. He had 3 bad games in the FIBA Cup. I think the last game against Argentina, he shot 2 for 6. Oh, Brazil. 2 for 6, 6 points, 22 minutes, with, I think, a lot of rebounds and assists. I think like 8 or 7. I think he was playing Leandro Barbosa, who's 73 years old. But 3 games is a small sample size, although we've seen a lot of minutes from Donovan Mitchell. And he seems like someone who just can't shoot. He can never get hot for long enough. And our eyes and our hearts tell us that he is a player who could get hot, who could maybe be in the conversation for an all-NBA team. We just have not seen it yet. And at some point, and I think we sell quicker than most fans, at some point we have to sell the idea of him being the top 3 player on the Jazz right now.
Yeah, I would say he might actually be the 4th best player on that team after Gobert, Conley, and maybe even the boy Joe Ingles. Ingles. But there's a lot more asked of Donovan Mitchell than Joe Ingles.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth mentioning here, just to his defense, that to be 22 years old last season and to average 24 points a game, like that's a lot of scoring. And I know points are overestimated and all that, but his efficiency was roughly around league average. Not great, but 24 points is a lot of offensive responsibility to shoulder for a guy in his second year.
And we value volume shooting now, and it's not like it was 4 years ago where we really frowned upon that. There needs to be a player on your court that can do that, as you said. but he wasn't especially good at it, and he would absolutely disappear in big moments in the playoffs. And if you call this FIBA tournament a big moment, going in, maybe some analysts really judge certain players, including Devin Booker, for not wanting to participate in this tournament, saying that it could really help their game and this is their time to work and expand their range, right? But Donovan Mitchell seems to have regressed again. And this goes to the point that Epstein makes quite a bit, is you have to stop doing something the same way every time. And Donovan Mitchell has yet to do that. In the macro, it's maybe you shouldn't play this summer. In the micro, it's maybe you shouldn't think that you're the hero ball guy every time. Maybe you should just change the kind of shots you take or change what you do on the court. Not in a wholesale way, in a very small way.
It's weird because I feel like we, and I, speaking for myself, I have definitely been critical of him for the same things that people have celebrated him for. So now I kind of feel inclined to defend him for what those same people are now turning against him for, if that makes sense. Just
I don't
the
think
natural
many people are turning
thing
against
is that
him.
he has fucking sucked in the playoffs. And that's not something that, to me, is that worrisome for a guy's first 2 playoff series. He was pretty good in the first round, if I remember correctly, 2 years ago. But he absolutely shat the bed this year. You know, he had a true shooting percentage of 42%, which is just abysmal, just a disgrace for a guy who's supposed to be your leading scorer. And it's mostly because he shot 25% from three-point range. And in the postseason, he's just shot really, really poorly from 3. And I look at those numbers and say, well, that's not necessarily a large enough sample size to say, this guy is a good three-point shooter at 35% for his career, but in the playoffs, he can't make threes. That just argument doesn't really hold water to me. So I kind of have to defend him and say, yeah, he was atrocious in the playoffs this season. But it was 5 games. He couldn't shoot. He was bad. They were leaving him alone out there. He was bricking them. And he made some poor decisions. But that doesn't really make him a different player than the one who scored 24 points a game at fairly, reasonable efficiency and was pretty good at creating offense, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I just feel like it's the same thing when we talk about Kyle Lowry, that Lowry was bad in the playoffs until he wasn't, and then they won a title, and now he's kind of redeemed for being bad for years and years and years in the playoffs. It's like, I don't really care how people play in the postseason.
And doubting skepticism is also natural, but then you arrive at the same place where the populist opinion is, which is Donovan Mitchell is pretty good, right? And that's the danger of that. And that's our Klay Thompson debate. And no one talks about Kyle Lowry in terms of MVP, but I've heard that discussed with Donovan Mitchell, and I wonder why, because, well, the reason is Michael Jordan. He just looks like Michael Jordan when he plays. But
look, Mitchell does some beautiful things in the court.
Yeah.
If we're talking about dribble bias, he's got finishing bias. He's got some beautiful sort of scoop shots and kind of jelly fam reverses around the basket. He has some gorgeous finishing moves that I don't think there's another player besides maybe Kyrie.
Or Keith Van Horn.
Or naturally KVH, who can finish with the kind of flair that he does around the basket.
And I also think of Paul George a little bit. These kind of the right physical dimensions of a player reminds us of Michael Jordan. And where players like Ben Simmons confuse us, or we judge Joel Embiid unfairly. These guys we give a pass to because they remind us of something that a lot of people think is perfect. And Mitchell, yeah, I'm not trying to. Mitchell has had a tough second season. All of his numbers kind of suffered a little bit, and you could look at what happened on the court. Maybe I don't watch the Jazz enough.
My general, he started out really poorly.
And he turned it on.
He kind of turned it on. And I think he's a pretty good offensive player. Not incredibly good. He's a good offensive player. The same way Devin Booker is a good offensive player. They're both fairly poor defensive players because they're not big. They don't really rebound. They don't get steals or blocks that much. I don't really know Mitchell's steal rate. They might be okay, but he's a mediocre defensive player at best. And
his steal percentage is 2.
And Booker is a terrible defensive player. So they're different in that regard.
Yeah.
But it kind of goes to what we were talking about last week, where what's the impact that a guy who mostly just scores has on your team? And that's where the range thing comes in, where we talk about shooting as a unitasker ability, but maybe scoring is also a unitasker ability.
Oh,
like
absolutely.
Overall scoring.
And that's where Kobe kind of moved up those ranks to like 35, 30, when we realized that volume shooting, even at its middle efficiency, was very, very valuable for winning games, for win shares.
It's like with Luka Doncic, man. He was so obviously the best prospect in that draft. He was the best player in Europe as a teenager, or at least one of the best, and the only one who was comparable in terms of his potential. And you had a certain segment of the basketball population who was skeptical of him. They doubted his ability to come into the NBA and succeed just because he wasn't playing against, I don't know, Loyola College and a bunch of guys who were going to be garbage men and investment brokers. Whatever. But now those people love him because he hit a couple daggers late in games and has like a cool step back. So it's like Mitchell is kind of reaping the whirlwind for being embraced by the exact kind of people who turn against you for having a bad postseason. Yeah,
Trae Young too. Trae Young hits a few game winners, and all of a sudden the perception is he might be better than Luka Doncic, which he isn't. But what I thought about too is...
But it's not just being bitchy that people, or at least some people, like players for the wrong reasons. But it wouldn't be But it wouldn't be fun if everybody liked everyone because they were like metrics darlings or because they were basketball geniuses. You need people that root on the guys who are distinctly non-basketball geniuses.
Oh, no doubt. We love the Knicks and Lakers for what they do, and fans for what they are. But it makes me think of the grit and grind Grizzlies, and Mike Conley was on those teams. Those teams were so good defensively. It was like heart-stoppingly good defensively. But they had no one who could score. And all they needed was that one guy who could give them 20 points a game. Kind of the kind of guys the Knicks collect, the Allen Houstons of the world. And your best defense, historically best defense, cannot win a series because you have no one who can shoot or no one who's willing to be a volume scorer.
And it's so fleeting, right? Because if Donovan Mitchell had just had a better shooting week, his jumper had just been falling, the ball was leaving his hand and it fluttering gracefully into the basket, that Utah Jazz team might have won a championship last year. Like, they had an incredible defense. They were one of the hottest teams in basketball. Their net rating indicated they were an absolute threat to win a title last season. And it didn't work out. And now he's viewed as a disappointment when his role as the primary scorer on a team that had a gnarly, suffocating defense was appropriate for him.
And that's the funny Boomers paradox, right? Because Mitchell, the results are he gets 20 points at any cost if it's not that efficient. And that would help the team. But him going cold and losing that series, a loss is also a metric. And we have to count these things. And that's kind of results-based, but it is what it is. It's sort of like no sin bin. There's only 16 games in football, so all these advanced analytics go into such a tiny sample size, but that's all we have. They don't play 80 games. And with Mitchell, yes, you're right. If he gets hot, they could win they could have won a championship last year, but he didn't, and they lost. And that is a metric.
And it's interesting to see in this era, a team that is more or less built like the Iverson era Sixers, where you have a bunch of guys who cannot create for themselves, and they are defensive stalwarts with one guy who's expected to more or less propel the offense by himself. And I think having Mike Conley, despite the fact that he's not a huge volume scorer, to alleviate some of that burden means a lot for the Jazz. Because now he doesn't have to do that on nights when he's not shooting that well. And the team doesn't go into a swoon when Donovan Mitchell has a string of, 2 bad weeks that the team just can't win games. So I think Conley is better than him overall as a player, but also doesn't mean that Donovan has to actually take on this enormous role that a second-year player probably is not fully equipped for.
I'm so done with the idea of everyone has to be the totality of all the things we want them to be in everything. Like Ben Simmons doesn't need a jumper. Donovan Mitchell doesn't need to be Michael Jordan, or he doesn't even need to be Jamal Crawford in his prime. He should just be exactly what he is.
Well, I'm mostly saying he doesn't have to be a great passer to be useful for that team.
That's what I mean.
He doesn't have to suddenly be James Harden. That would be better. James Harden is a vastly superior player to Donovan Mitchell. But he doesn't have to be that to still be good and useful. It just means that someone else has to inhabit that role.
And it's funny you use James Harden as an example, who's divisive because he's such a poor defender. And he's not actually that bad of a defender, but he does too many things on the court to be good at everything. It just doesn't happen.
So now you're arguing against range. You hate range.
Oh, no. My original conceit was I think that way of thinking works, but the opposite is just as valuable.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I agree with both. I think this is a nice spongy ground because
it's fun.
As we were talking last week about having big guys who can rebound and distribute seems to be just the glitch to making your team good. The Draymonds, LeBrons, Ben Simmons, it's just a glitch. Giannis, you got a big guy who can score and distribute and rebound, and you just get so much production from one dude that it allows you to screw around with other roster spots and put in guys who don't contribute that much.
I mean, LeBron James would be the apex of that, right?
Absolutely. And Giannis is there behind him in that same, we're just getting a trove of contributions from one dude in a way that Donovan Mitchell can't do that. He can't give you elite distribution or rebounding or defend 4 positions. He's got to be the guy who just gives you scoring. That's kind of my thing is that Mitchell can be the best version of himself, but the best version of Donovan Mitchell is probably not a superstar.
Yeah, and the interns can roast him for jokes, but let's be kind to these players. I mean, he is a cop, but sometimes there's good cops, and he should just be the exact cop he could be.
I mean, he did bring this upon himself, though, because whether he just okayed the Adidas marketing campaign of rookie ?
Oh, he loved it.
He wore that shit around. It was one of the most wild, dry snitching ass campaigns I have ever seen.
And
he's better than me, but is he really a rookie? He did get hurt. It wasn't like Ben Simmons cheated. He got hurt and missed a whole season. It was a wild thing to pretend like Simmons had gamed the system by breaking a foot and missing an entire year of his career.
And this is when the interns were Gestradamuses, right? Because he actually in Twitter was like, I love cops. Me and Ingles, man, on the force. We were like, well,
he is a cop.
It is what it is. The eye test turns true.
He's such a cop. He's a huge member of alcohol, firearms, and tobacco.
But Ben, if there's bad cops,
he's one of the alphabet boys.
If there's bad cops, there has to be good cops, right? So for every Kamala Harris, there's a Donovan Mitchell. I mean, shout out to Kamala Harris. I don't even know why I did that.
She was a bad cop.
Yeah.
Is Donovan a good cop, though? I don't know.
I mean, all that stuff wasn't good fun, and like we say, we love to joke about it, but we love a villain too, and he was a participant in that whole WWF vibe, and he didn't really care, but he's like, all right, let's start this whole thing. This is funny.
The Jazz need to be villains. They've been a weird team over the last few years who's been very good. They're well respected, but no one has any strong feelings about the Jazz.
They don't really acquire many players who aren't cops.
Yeah, it's a cop organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shield, the Utah badge of honor.
What if?
But in general, no one says, "Oh, fuck the Jazz." I kind of want to say "fuck the Jazz." Like they've got really obnoxious fans, like awful fans.
Oh, you're gaslighting. What do you mean by obnoxious?
It's like from Twitter to in the arena. They're notoriously shitty fans. They say wild stuff to players. They're really humorless on Twitter. They're super defensive. I mean, look, all fan bases are like that to a degree, but Utah is like fairly specific in that regard.
Yeah, and
they are like a crusty ass fan base.
I mean, no superstars want to go there. Salt Lake City is a very religious town. It's not, talk about diversity, it's not that diverse. But if you were, like, if Kevin Durant was all of a sudden this summer said, get me on the Utah Jazz, find a way, would Utah embrace him? Or would they be, he's not really one of us?
Yeah, I have no idea because, I don't know. They don't have a lot of, they're kind of relegated in their own way. Where they've built a San Antonio style franchise kind of underneath the radar. But San Antonio was kind of like developing talent and doing a lot of trades and Utah doesn't feel like they really swap players around too much.
Well, like the Knicks,
Conley's obviously like the biggest guy they've had in a while that I can think of.
And like the Knicks, they're deeply religious. Their ownership and fan base is of a specific mindset. And I think that really influences their basketball moves because they do, I think, look at maybe too much the totality of a person before trading for them or wanting to sign them. They did sign Carlos Boozer, though. But, like, I bring up Durant because Durant made news this week. And it was kind of not about things on the court. It was about fan bases and other things.
Well, so Kevin Durant did an interview with the Wall Street Journal in which he was critical of not necessarily players, but of the NBA's ecosystem and extending his distaste for the business of the game to the behavior of fans, to front offices, to ownership groups, etc. And he detailed how Oklahoma City was so wrathful in turning on him when he left. And when he came back, they had cupcakes everywhere because he was soft, and that was their way of communicating that insult via pastry. And there were videos of someone like shooting one of his jerseys with a gun, and he felt like everyone in the organization was just really rude to him. And he's like, well, I just left the team, and they didn't have to treat me like that. And he really went after OKC as being incredibly bitter and hostile towards him for simply choosing to play somewhere else. Whether he's right or wrong, or they should have treated him differently, I don't know. I can't say that. If someone leaves your team, are you supposed to then be cool with them? Like, you don't have to burn their jersey or shoot it, but do you have to say welcome home? I don't know. That's especially if you're within the organization, and the way that he left was incredibly traumatic. But he also, I'm not saying anyone should be sort of. I also think you can expect some hostility, but it doesn't mean that people have to be dicks. Like, it's both things. Anyway. Right, it's like with Mike Scott showing up at the Eagles game wearing a Redskins jersey. Like, you can expect hostility, but no one needs to try to start a fight with you or use racial slurs. Like, expect some booing and some ribbing and some glares, but that's part of the game. It doesn't need to go up to another plateau. But what Katie also brought into that interview in the Wall Street Journal that I thought was interesting was that he feels as if the mental health of players is being discussed a lot, but that same scrutiny is not being applied to the mental health of fans, of front offices, of ownership groups. And I thought that was interesting because he's right. And whether he's saying mental health almost as an insult, well, are they healthy? Are they not depressed? Are they happy? it is interesting because we do focus on the players in a weird, creepy way, almost of, are these racehorses happy? Are they are they at their peak physical abilities because their brains are operating right? And we don't really talk about it in terms of owners or fans or executives.
I absolutely love that idea, and it's sort of the point where the worst politicians, the worst acting politicians in our world right now, do a lot of dumb things, and people go at them with a lot of venom, and then they turn around and be like, "You guys seem as crazy as I do," and we're just like, "No, we don't." And I'm like, that's a fair thing to think, and I think when fans do certain things, like you said, like shoot jerseys, yell obscenities, talk about people's lives outside the court, I think players are immediately allowed to think that, are these fans okay? Like, what's going on? This isn't like human behavior. It's transformed into something else. And I think we can talk about whether the internet has changed our brains for better and worse, and the way that things were happening before. Is it just because we can see it more clearly now, or has there been an evolution in the way we kind of view this thing that isn't necessarily as healthy as it could be?
Well, it's kind of bringing together a few of the topics we were talking about with like the Overton window and the Mike Scott incident, where okay, you can is it acceptable that you can wear an opposing jersey to a football game and people will like try to fight you? That seems insane. And at one point in my life, I would have been like, that's cool. Oh yeah, you don't go to someone's stadium with another jersey and expect not to get like beaten to a pulp. I'm like, that's insane. Like, get a fucking life. Like, are you kidding me? You're gonna fight someone because they wear a jersey from another team? That's insane.
And this will take time, and I think that's why I'm so far I'm really happy with all the things that Gen Z is offering, because like this will change. It's just going to take a long time, but I think by the time hopefully if we're still around in 20 or 30 years, we'll be on this pod and this won't be an issue. But wearing another tribe's colors inside another tribe's home, and I say tribe, but just like a way of thinking, or being a contrarian.
For sure.
By definition.
You do that in European football, and you're going to have the same kind of thing. It's not a uniquely American active aggression. And like, it's global. Like, if you're Boca River and those games in Argentina, like, that kind of hostility is minor in comparison to the kind of violence that's anticipated in those kind of games.
And this is also the difference between smart contrarianism and bad contrarianism. If someone wears a jersey into an opposing team's arena, you could, just by the way they act, you could tell if they're either or. If they're antagonizing people, that's bad contrarianism. If they're like, this is my favorite team, I grew up in this city, I'm here to support my team, they might get some ribbing, but like, you could tell when someone's not aggressive.
Yeah, that's true too. I agree with that. But the KD thing about mental illness, look, LeBron said it fairly appropriately in a way that no one liked, when he was like, yeah, you're mad at me now, go back to your like loser life. Or like, however
that was funny.
He said, I'm like, that's kind of true, man.
Of course.
All of us are invested in sports in a way that is seemingly a slightly discordant with being a normal person.
And this is how politicians feel and musicians feel about criticism. I believe Lana Del Rey got a really nuanced but unfavorable review, and she went at that person on Twitter. And even the god Bill Simmons talked about this, and Devin Booker. He said, why are we not allowed to criticize players anymore? How come we just can't do this thing because this is the thing we're doing? Although all he does is criticize players, and this is better than ever because now Lana Del Rey and Devin Booker can clap back, and we have a new dynamic, but we're still criticizing everything as much as we did.
Yeah, that's the only change here, is that there is a certain amount of discomfort that the voices, that the roles have changed, right? Where you had the people who are the punditry, and then you had the athletes, and now the athletes can counter the punditry on a neutral ground, we'll say, of like, say, social media. But the pundits can't really do anything back on, say, like the athletic field. So someone who's a basketball analyst can make fun of a player. That player can clap back, so to speak, and get a lot of laughs and people scorning the writer, but the writer can't go and like dunk on the player.
Right. Yeah, that paradigm has shifted. And this is what I do a really bad job at, admittedly, is sometimes I should take the source into account more. If a writer is not into Lana Del Rey's record, I should know what the writer likes and what the writer doesn't. For example, if you go to a restaurant and someone says, "This is not my favorite slice of pizza," I need to find out if you're into deep dish or thin. You know, like I want to find out if you're into Neapolitan or not. I need more information. And what Kevin Durant is saying is we have no information on these people who just like do these egregious things in his point of view. But they have everything on him.
It's really an understandable point of view. You know, I'll sit there and tweet for years, Julius Okafor is bad. The defense has collapsed again with Okafor as a turnstile out there. And if you're him, you're like, hey, fuck you, dude. You just, for years, you've just been like ragging on me and my defense and like, you don't like my spin moves. Well, I'm better at basketball than you are at basketball, or you and anyone else you know or have ever played against. I'm probably better at my career than you are at yours. So like, why are you like dogging me all the time?
Yeah, and
I get it. They're not wrong. It's just like the paradigm has shifted from there being this delineation where it's like, here are the people who talk shit, and then these guys do their thing over here. Now that everything is intermarried, it's like it becomes personal versus a way that we could at least pretend was impersonal. When you can tag someone and criticize them to their face in a way that they will almost certainly read, it's a totally different dynamic than like us just pretending what was written in the newspaper like flutters off into the ether.
And I think what Durant was talking about in this article takes it a step even further. And we could all agree to be better people and just like not, you know, just soften up, be chill, you know? But what he's talking about is something that No Sin Bin has kind of gone by the wayside in the NFL. We're not talking about CTE and mental brain damage anymore. And I think the NBA doesn't have that problem, but they've had a really great year with Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan and even Royce White in the orbit talking about mental health. And what Durant is saying is if we can talk about the mental health and the mental wellness and unwellness of basketball players, then it's easy for me just to look at the person accusing me of unwellness and ask the same question to that person.
Yeah, I don't think that's unfair at all. And when we see the behavior of owners, whether it's Donald Sterling or James Dolan or Mark Cuban or whoever, and it's also fair to say, why are they like this? Why are they attempting to build a team in this fashion? What's their angle here? What are they trying to gain as a person? Is this something that they've subsumed their identity into? Or are they just a sort of passive owner who's almost watching this from afar and hopes the team does well?
And this is a real...
But sorry, the only last thing I was going to say was, in all these situations, you never really know unless the person tells you. And it kind of goes to the thing of like wanting it more. Like, we have no fucking idea how anybody wants something. And we've been doing this in sports forever. And this is just a new exchange. We've always been analyzing whether someone was scared of the moment or a shrinking violet when the game was on the line, or if they were, a true competitor with grit who really wanted to win. And now it's more like, I think he has anxiety. I think he's nervous out there. He might need to see a psychologist. It's like we're still doing the same thing, just in a more enlightened way almost.
Which I'm into. And even talking about those results in Epstein and the sports gene, it's like maybe the NBA now has like better shoes. It comes down to all these small things. Maybe there's more air conditioning in the arena, but previously, when you started this point, it got me thinking about, and this is like the murkiest thing I deal with in my life a little bit. Let's say Donald Sterling is a tough example because he just seems like an awful dude. But sometimes when I look at older players, and before the NBA was invented in 1996, it's not Magic Johnson's fault that he didn't take threes. Just no one took threes. It's not like he didn't want to take threes. It just wasn't in the ether. He wasn't told to do it. It's sort of occasionally when I get like racially slurred on the street. Very racial episode. I apologize. No more after this. But occasionally when someone will...
Well, you deserve it for your behavior with Julius Randle.
Occasionally when people say something to me, my first reaction as like an older person is, oh, it's not your fault. You don't even know me. You'd like me if you knew me, I would hope. You don't even mean that. And the person with me will sometimes say like, how'd you let him get away with that? And that's how I feel, but I understand where that person is coming from as well, the person I'm with, which is that person is such a dick. How could you just take that? I'm like, oh, he doesn't mean it. It's usually
you've always been very charitable in these kind of things, and your perspective is certainly unique.
Yeah, I mean, I'm defeatist. I'm short, like I've had to be this way, but like I can't fight. I'm no Mike Scott, Ben.
Maybe you'd want to think about getting a handgun, for example.
Right.
Something to get some raccoon venison and to lick shots at the haters.
As long as I don't have to turn in my samurai sword. But you know what I mean? Like, so is it James Dolan's fault that he's the worst owner in professional sports? Or is he a product of a generation that doesn't know how to do this?
Absolutely. Or can't it be both?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all of this is both. But that I forgive him halfway. And a lot of times I think that's even too generous, but he's trying his best.
I'm out on all your Dolan bashing at this point. Oh, I mean...
No, I'm pro Dolan sometimes.
Yeah, I've kind of turned around on Dolan.
No,
he may have the wrong people running the team, but he's not seemingly doing anything.
And he's not answering to like your perception of winning and being in the NBA. He taught me that it was okay to be, different. And, us creative art kids, we needed someone like James Dolan to show us that it's okay not to be in the NBA. You could lose for 20 seasons in a row, but crush it in your blues band.
Yes. And, I don't know. The Dolan thing has kind of shifted for me. He's not a Steinbrenner. He's not...
Who was very successful.
Yes. So it's weird. Like, you spend enough in baseball that you're able to buy all the talent and you eventually win. So
that's not how it went down, though. Stick Michaels. He hired a smart guy, Gene Michaels.
Right. I just mean the knock on the Yankees was that they couldn't win despite winning all the money, spending all the money and like signing all the Dave Winfields and all that. And then they eventually won when they got smart.
He went analytics. He hired a guy who started looking at value instead of names and who developed the farm system. And now we're here. It's amazing how that works.
And that's all James Dolan needs to do. If he just went out and got like a Sam Hinkie, you would have the Nets situation with a better brand name.
Well, in Epstein and Range, I mean, in this interview with Zach Lowe, he talks about Sam Hinkie and not Dolan specifically, but if you're a losing basketball team, would it hurt you to bring in an expert on wellness, an expert on game theory, an expert in the stock market? Just hire these people and they'll help you because it's not working. It's like a variant in the game. You have to I think he used this example. Shaquille O'Neal was really poor from the free throw line and he could never figure it out. And he suggested he needed to take one step farther back from the line just to slightly change that variant.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I will say this. Next week, maybe Jordan won't be on vacation, and that will add an extra variant to the show that was missing today. So despite its perfection, it could be a different variant of perfection.
That's right.
Next week.
So this was the perfect pod in a Dolan-esque sense. is what you're saying.
In one universe, this is a perfect pod, but in a parallel universe in which Jordan is not hot dog legging on a dog dish full of Bombay sapphire, it could be another perfect pod.
The multiverse of perfect pods. I'm into this.
Cookies.
Cookies.